Okay, you just heard that Old Testament reading and that New Testament reading. Do they kind of seem like they're mismatched to you? Well, the first time I read them, I said, what? What do I do with this? But I did my homework, and I found some similarities, and I generated 3 questions that emerged for me from these readings. And so I'm going to tell you what I found and how I found it. All right? I'm going to back up just a little bit with the Abraham story. Abraham was sitting under the shade of a tree at the entrance to his tent, getting as much cool air as he could. We understand that today. And out of the shimmering heat of the desert, he sees coming toward him 3 men. And he jumps up and he runs over to them and he bows and he offers them food and hospitality. Well, you say, is this some kind of bizarre behavior? No, that's the point. It's absolutely ordinary and expected hospitality. The hospitality of the desert was very crucial to life and death. And Abraham, as a nomad, would have understood that he could be the next person whose life hangs in the balance of hospitality. So, one of the men then offers this blessing, this prophecy blessing, that Sarah and Abraham would have a son within the year. They are both in their 90s. They have been praying for a son all of their lives. And they're offered this blessing, that this will happen. It's a momentous moment. And we began to realize that this is God. One of these 3 men is God. And he sends the other 2 ahead. And God lingers with Abraham. Abraham and God are tight. They have a covenant. They have a real, personal, intimate relationship with one another. And God begins to talk with Abraham. And he talks about the problem of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's sharing. Well, God says he's on his way to find out if these people in Sodom and Gomorrah are as bad as he's hearing. All these prayers and pleas are coming up to him. This is not the God that we're used to when we read the New Testament. It's an earlier interpretation of God. But this God that's meeting with Abraham is clearly listening to prayer. And he's clearly responding in a very personal way. So I said, our first question was, and this is taken from today's headlines, do all lives matter to God? Well, that's what Abraham wants to know. Abraham wants to know if God cares about each individual. You see, in Abraham's day, the community was the focal point. The community is what mattered. A community had to be at least 12 men. But there was no concern about each person or 1 or 2 people. It was the community that the focus was on. And Abraham says, well, we need to work up to this. Kind of in a Middle Eastern fashion, but God is not haggling with him because God keeps saying, yes, yes, 50, yes, 40, yes, 30, yes. God never says no. And we work down to 10, which is where Abraham stops because that's below the magic number of community. Suddenly, 12 people are 12 individual people. And God says, yes, I will save the city for 10 individual people. So the answer is yes to our first question. Well, it would be reasonable at this point to say, so what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah? What was so terribly bad there? Well, that question has been discussed for hundreds of years. Ezekiel had an answer. Ezekiel said it was disregard for the poor, the people's pride in their own prosperity and their complacency. Isaiah says they had empty faith and their hands were bloody with injustice. Jeremiah was more specific. Adultery, living in lies, siding with the wicked, provoking others to evil. And in Genesis we find this accusation of terrible violence against each other and lacking our old friend hospitality. Lacking hospitality is a terrible crime because people were so dependent on each other. That meant life and death to people. So we find this broad, this comes every category basically. It's socio-economic sin, it's moral sin, it covers everything, this list of what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. So we go back to our two men who were traveling with God. We don't know who they were. That's not the point. But they appear in Sodom, and Lot sees them come into the city. Lot is coincidentally Abraham's nephew. And he offers hospitality. And he means to protect these two strangers coming into the city. But Lot is appalled when a vicious mob comes to his house to attack these two men. And Lot goes so far as to offer to give the mob his two daughters and save the two men, which is unthinkable to us, that we would offer our children, put them in danger to protect two men we didn't know 20 minutes ago. It points out two things. It points out how out of control these cities were. And secondly, how very serious this responsibility of hospitality was taken. The mob goes so far as to call Lot an immigrant. They use it as an ethnic slur. And they threaten his life as well. So that brings me to the second question. What should our attitude be toward immigrants and strangers and refugees? Well, we looked at this kind of a little bit 2 weeks ago at the Good Samaritan story, but the answer is that generosity and compassion for immigrants and refugees has always been the rule for God's people, entirely through the Bible. And the Lutheran Church has actually created a Bible study of all the incidents of how God's people are to treat immigrants and refugees. But one point is clear. Sodom and Gomorrah has completely severed their relationship with God. You can see that by their actions. And that puts us in the right place to move over to the New Testament. You know, it's kind of a stunning thing when you turn the page from Genesis over to Luke and you're reading something so completely different. You say, these are too incongruent to work with. But Jesus tells us this remarkable and often misunderstood story of a man who comes asking for bread to feed a traveler who had arrived late at night. I have dubbed it the parable of the midnight bread run. So, of course there's the hospitality thing involved in this story. But there's more than that. Something else is going on. And it starts with a phrase that's not in your reading. Your reading says, suppose if. Well, the words that Jesus are quoted in the early documents, the early manuscripts would be translated literally as, who from you? Kind of like, which one of you? Do any of you? It starts that way. And it's a particularly important phrase because it occurs 11 times in the Gospel. And And the answer to his question, when he starts it with this, who from you, is always no. So we've got a frame here. We know where he's going. And he has this long, involved question that's easy to get lost in. It's kind of punctuated more like Paul would do a sentence. You know, Paul is famous for those what if, and, but, then, and kind of sentences. And Jesus doesn't usually do that, but he does here. So I've tried to compact it a little bit so we can get to the question point before we forget what the opening was. Who from you, which of you, has a friend to whom you go at midnight and say, lend me 3 loaves of bread? And your friend would say, don't bother me. I'm not able to get up. The answer is no. I'm not going to give you anything. Who would have a friend like that? Do you have a friend like that that would say, no, don't bother me. I'm not going to help you? You wouldn't be your friend if you said that, right? All right. So the people listen to Jesus' question and they say, no, that's unthinkable. That's unimaginable. That's not how life works here. The sleeper will hand over the bread, no matter what. They depend on that. Well, something else happens in this passage where we get hung up. Think about it. It was just read to you. Did the man coming to get the bread knock? Doesn't say anything about knocking. Did he say, oh, please, you've got to give me the bread. I need the bread. Won't you give me the bread? I need 3 loaves of bread. I already asked you for bread. Won't you get up and get it? Please, please, I need it now. No, he didn't. He said, I've got this friend who just got here. I don't have any bread. Can you give me some bread? There's no persistence. There's no repetition. Friends, we have a Greek problem, one of those sneaky little Greek problems. The Greek word that's translated in your book as persistence is anaidia. Ana is like un for us. It means not, no. And idia is the word shame. So it's no shame, or shameless, or rude. Other translations frequently use bold, older translations, because being bold, when they were translated, was being rude. Okay? So, we're saying here, this guy gets up, even though the neighbor is being rude. Can you think about this? What is the poor sleeping man saying? You have no bread. I saw you shoving bread in your mouth at 6 o'clock last night. You didn't break bread so you'd have some for the morning. Are you kidding me? You're waking me? The baby will probably cry for the next 2 hours? Yeah, take the bread. Go away. He's calling the guy rude. Some people think that the sleeper represents God. Well, no, the sleeper doesn't. In fact, that's one of Jesus' points. The sleeper is in contrast to God. Jesus is teaching us about God's reaction to our prayers. And God does not say, oh, those people are driving me crazy. That's not God. This is a how much more parable. As in, if the sleeper rises to answer a rude request, how much more will God answer? Think of that verse in Matthew chapter 6, you know, when he talks about the flowers and the birds are being numbered and the flowers were wilt. If God cares about the birds and the flowers, are they important? How much more will God care about you? This is a how much more parable. You know, God, the one who responded to Abraham and Sarah's prayers for a son, the God who responded to the outcry against the evil in Sodom and Gomorrah. Jesus is saying, I'm assuring you, no, more than that, I'm giving you absolute certainty that God responds even to the point of giving us himself, giving us the Holy Spirit when we are in need. Jesus is saying, bread smed. He's giving you the Holy Spirit. How much more can he give you? And you're certain of it. There's no, will the neighbor get up? No. God is always there. God always hears. And God always responds. That's the teaching. It is affirmation of the importance of prayer. It is invitation to prayer. Now, here's my third question. Is prayer, then, the defining difference? And look at it in the light of our two readings. First of all, we have Sodom and Gomorrah. They have severed their relationship with God. They are thinking that they can depend on their own power. They don't have to depend on God or fellow human beings. And then we have people with a prayerful relationship with God. And the difference here seems to be this prayer relationship we have. It would seem to me that that kind of dependence on God completes us as being made in the image of God. Amen.